So I'm very honored to be able to present my research project to you, which is entitled White Blood Cells in Disguise. And first of all, I'd like to introduce myself a little bit. And I did my master's degree in molecular life sciences, and I did it in the Transnational University of Limburg, which is the collaboration between Hasselt University and this university. So I'm one of those regional students that was talked about this morning. And during my time here in Maastricht, I got acquainted with the research going on in the different topics and research groups. And this really enhanced my interest in science and scientific research. So I decided to pursue a career in research, and I did my PhD here in Maastricht at the Department of Molecular Genetics on liver inflammation. After obtaining my PhD, I went to France for a postdoc at the Institut Pasteur in Lille to study the role of inflammation in obesity and arteriosclerosis. And after 4 years spending my time there, since actually the beginning of this week, I'm back in the country, and I just started working at the Department of Internal Medicine. And this is today I would like to take this opportunity to present to you the research that I will be developing there. So, as you all probably know, is that humans have evolved gradually and slowly within several stages. And the last 50 or so years, a very fast and new evolution has taken place, which is the evolution of obesity. Due to increased intake of food and less exercise, people are getting more and more obese. And how do we define obesity? This is defined by calculating one's body mass index. And in short, you just take one's body weight and you divide it by the square of their height. For example, for me, 180, I can weigh about in between 60 and 80 kilograms, and then I have a normal BMI, which is in between 18 and 25. Above 25, you're overweight, and even more, above 30, you are called obese. So obesity is becoming a very big problem, also in the Netherlands, and as you can appreciate from this slide, the last 30 years, obesity percentage in the population has increased enormously. And this is a very big problem, not only practical or aesthetical, but obesity increases the risk to develop associated diseases, such as respiratory disease, liver disease. For example, I'd like to focus briefly on type 2 diabetes, which is called diabetes of the elderly. But nowadays, with children being more and more obese, also children develop this diabetes of the elderly. So just to tell you that this is really getting an enormous problem. And where today I will specifically focus on is the fact that obesity enlarges your risk to develop cardiovascular disease. And cardiovascular disease is at this moment in the Western world the #1 killer. So you can appreciate with obesity rising even further the coming years, leading to all kinds of diseases and especially heart disease, that morbidity and mortality will increase. Also, there will be an enormous burden on healthcare, with economic costs being already over 3 billion euros in 2009. So this will only increase more. And therefore, identifying the exact link between obesity and cardiovascular disease, so why do these obese people develop heart disease, is a very important research question. And this is where I'll focus on. One of the possible links between these diseases may be inflammation. As illustrated here in Time magazine of some years ago, inflammation has been shown to be the underlying cause of several diseases, among which heart disease and obesity. So therefore, I'll briefly introduce to you the concept of inflammation. And inflammation is there to protect the body from harm, from tissue damage, and from infiltrating pathogens such as bacteria. And inflammation is initiated to remove these substances, to initiate healing. And this is carried out by white blood cells such as macrophages and dendritic cells. And these are attracted to the site of injury and start eating, for example, here the bacteria, and they initiate an inflammatory response at this site. Now, inflammation is part of the body's immune system. And the immune system is divided into two big parts. You've got the innate immune system, which I just explained to you, which is non-specific inflammation and where pathogens are killed by eating, by these macrophages and dendritic cells. But on the other hand, you also have the adaptive immune system. And here you can already sense it in the name. The adaptive immune system can adapt to the circumstances. So by adapting to these circumstances, it can generate a specific response against a pathogen. This is carried out by cells called B and T cells. And once they are activated and they can recognize a pathogen for which they have built up memory, for example, you get the chickenpox at 10 years old, the next time you come into contact with this virus, you won't get sick anymore due to this memory and the very rapid and powerful response that is generated against it. However, this adaptive immune response needs to be activated. And this happens by dendritic cells. And once these dendritic cells have activated the adaptive immune system, this will lead to even more inflammation. So you can appreciate that these dendritic cells are really very powerful and important cells of the immune system. So let's pose the question, inflammation, is it now good or bad? Because it protects from disease, but it also can cause disease. Well, you have to make a distinction between acute inflammation, which is there acutely when you need it, and for the time needing to defend against a pathogen. However, when inflammation gets chronic, this means during months or even years, then the surrounding healthy tissues and cells may get damaged. And this is when inflammation can be bad. And two examples of inflammatory disease, as I already mentioned, are both atherosclerosis, which is a major cause of cardiovascular disease, and obesity. And both of them have a central role for macrophages. For example, here, this is an illustration of how atherosclerosis develops. This is the vessel wall of a blood vessel, and cholesterol, and we all know that cholesterol is not good for your heart and for your vessels, starts accumulating in the vessel wall. And then macrophages get activated by this cholesterol, and they start eating the cholesterol. And this generates large macrophages filled with cholesterol. These macrophages get activated, start initiating inflammation, and there's a lot of accumulation of lipids and cells in the vessel wall, causing the vessel wall to expand. And this can lead to a nearly blockage of the blood flow. So once a blood clot comes into in contact because the plaque ruptures, this can completely block blood flow to a specific part of the heart. And then heart tissue can die. And this is what we call a heart attack. So next to atherosclerosis, also obesity is an inflammatory disease. And this I would like to illustrate by these microscopic pictures of fat tissue. These round cells are the fat cells, or adipocytes, which store the fat of the body. And in a normal person, in a normal adipose tissue, you see this brown cell occasionally, which is a macrophage, which are present throughout the body, no problem. However, and this is the same microscopic magnification, in obese fat tissue, you see that these adipocytes are much larger, of course, because they have to stock all the excessive fat, and you see an increased number of these brownish cells. So macrophages accumulate also in the fat tissue during obesity. And not only this accumulation of macrophages in the obese adipose tissue is a problem. As I show you here in green instead of red, these are in green the macrophages, and there are a lot more in the obese adipose tissue. But another thing happens as well, and it's important to note that in immunology, cells are classified according to the molecules they express. And the macrophages of obese adipose tissue, and unfortunately it's not really clear here, start expressing a marker called CD11C. And CD11C is actually a marker that is specific for dendritic cells. So one can say that these macrophages take on another appearance, they put on another coat and resemble dendritic cells. They disguise themselves as dendritic cells. So disguise is one thing, but what's an important question is whether their appearance may be the same, but it's not known whether they also can do the same things as dendritic cells. And this is a very important question with respect to inflammation, as I explained to you, because dendritic cells are very important and powerful immune cells. And from these observations comes my hypothesis that these obesity-induced macrophages, which are in disguise, that those are part of the reason that cardiovascular risk is increased in obese persons. In more detail, during obesity, when adipose tissue expands, there's this, the macrophages, which are normal first, disguise themselves as dendritic cells, and if they share the same function also as dendritic cells, they can do the same things, which is migrating out of the tissue and elsewhere in the body, induce this adaptive immune response, which will lead to increased inflammation. And this, I hypothesize, that will increase the risk of atherosclerosis formation. So to investigate this, my first research goal will be to identify what the exact differences are between these normal macrophages and these macrophages in disguise. And to do this, I will be using mouse models, and I will give them a high-fat diet. And this will generate a fat mouse, as you can see clearly in this picture, but also, more scientifically, in the increase in body weight. And when I isolate the macrophages of the adipose tissue, of the fat tissue of these mice, then you can see that the CD11C expression, which is the marker for the dendritic cells, is enormously increased in the fat animals. So this means I have generated an experimental model which copies the situation with the disguising of the macrophages that I explained to you before. And with this model, I can isolate these cells and then compare them to each other. First of all, I will see whether we can find molecular markers that are specific for one cell type or the other. And in the second place, very importantly, I will try to discover whether these disguised macrophages can also do the same things as dendritic cells. Now, secondly, when I've identified that they actually do the same things, of course it's important to see whether these cells will then actually induce arteriosclerosis development. And this I will again perform with a mouse experiment, and I will isolate the adipose tissue of a normal mouse with the normal macrophages and the adipose tissue of a fat mouse with the macrophages in disguise, and I will transplant this adipose tissue into mice that develop atherosclerosis. And then, of course, I will compare the development of atherosclerosis between these transplanted mice. Why do I do this transplantation? Well, very briefly, this will allow me to look at only the cells that I transplanted into the acceptor mouse. And I will not be biased by, for example, the diet that was given in these mice, or the fact that they are much heavier and that they are obese. So this reduces the bias in these studies. And I already performed some preliminary experiments, and what I found was that cells which are originating from the transplanted adipose tissue could be found as early as 1 and 2 weeks in the blood circulation of the acceptor mouse. So this actually indicates that the cells from the adipose tissue that I transplanted leave the adipose tissue and can exert functions in the host. So therefore, I think this is a very good model to investigate the role on atherosclerosis development. So what I expect to find is, first of all, to identify novel mechanisms of atherosclerosis development, which in the long term may lead to new therapeutical approaches. And secondly, I hope to identify biological markers that may identify those obese patients which are at particular risk to develop atherosclerosis. And those patients may then benefit from early treatment, for example, with cholesterol-lowering agents such as statins. Of course, as I explained, all my experiments will be taking place in mouse models, and it's of course very important to translate this to the human situation. And to do this, I will make use of the Maastricht study, which is a very big study of including 10,000 participants of the area around Maastricht. Half of them will have type 2 diabetes, and half of them don't. And these are very detailedly followed up on morbidity and mortality for over 10 years. And the objective of the Maastricht study is to improve the insight into the causes of and development of both type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and of course also the interplay between these two. And for me, the most interesting question will of course be whether I can use the biomarkers that I identified in mice whether I can also use these biomarkers to predict which of those people will actually develop cardiovascular disease and which ones will not. And thanks to the access we have to patients and clinical samples and data, the high-tech biomarker screening technologies and the epidemiological expertise at the Department of Internal Medicine, where I will conduct my research, I'm confident, or perhaps I should say optimistic, that we will get there. So finally, I would like to acknowledge NWO for funding my research, which is officially called the Obesity-Induced Macrophage, a new player in atherosclerosis development. And as I mentioned, this research will be done at the Department of Internal Medicine of Professor Schalkwijk and Professor Steenhoor. So I thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. So, questions, Remo, please.
My name is Ger van der Vussen from the Department of Physiology, and I was wondering, could you elaborate a little bit more on the role of the fat cells in this story? So are they just innocent bystanders, or are they playing an active role in the transition of the macrophages to the dendritic cells and the other pathological conditions you are describing?
I'm sure they do. First of all, I presented only part of the global project, and in my Veni project I aim to investigate the effects of free fatty acids that are known to accumulate in obese adipose tissue, and the different types, but especially the short chain saturated ones. And I will investigate whether these fatty acids will induce such a phenotype. But of course, adipocytes themselves can also secrete cytokines and chemokines, which can also influence this. But that's something that we'll have to look further at.
Okay, yes.
Thank you for a clear presentation. My name is Bullich of the Maastricht Health Campus. I think it's very interesting that you are going to transplant those adipose tissue cells to other mice. But I was wondering, doesn't that influence the immune system of the mouse? Doesn't it induce an immune response? And do you try to suppress it, or how do you cope with that? And does that influence your experiment?
Well, that's a very good remark. And fortunately, in mouse biology, we've got a series of congenic mouse strains, which are interbred constantly. And so the immunological differences between those animals are practically zero. So there are no immunological issues concerned with that. So it's a very good question.
Yes, please.
My name is Peter Kitzler. I am a former surgeon and professor of vascular surgery here. We are sitting here all together because we are celebrating Maastricht and Maastricht University. Is your research something which is done everywhere in the world? Is there something unique to it, specifically unique for Maastricht? Could it be performed elsewhere, or has Maastricht a special position facilitating your research?
Well, I think it can be performed elsewhere, especially the animal part. The adipose tissue transplantations is a technique that is being used in other domains of research, which has been done. But I think with this research question, for now, I hope, I'm the only one with this hypothesis. But on the other hand, which makes, for me, coming to Maastricht very interesting, especially at the department, is the presence of many cohorts, not only the Maastricht study, but the access to a lot of clinical samples, and even adipose tissue from human origin is a very big strength, in my belief, for this project.
That is an asset of Maastricht for you?
That's for me, yes.
Of course, it's a very unhealthy region. Huh?
Yeah. There's a lot of access.
A lot of doctors
over
here and researchers. So we create our own
Yeah, that's
samples. Huh? That's special for Maastricht. That's not for the TV. Huh? Okay, next question or remark. Yes, again.
On one of your first slides, you showed a relationship between obesity and type 2 diabetes.
yes.
What is the mechanism?
Yeah.
Why? Can you explain it? Why will people, with obese people, develop a higher rate of diabetic 2?
Well, the key hallmark of type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance. So insulin is secreted in response to sugar, which makes cells take up more sugar. And if people are obese, then the cells get resistant to insulin. And this is, of course, then the tissues take up less sugar and the blood sugar levels will increase. And this is what happens. So the question is actually, what induces insulin resistance? And there are a lot of theories which probably all are partly true. There's the increased accumulation of fats in the adipocytes, which makes adipocytes, due to stress, function less. But there's also a big part for inflammation, where it's known that inflammatory pathways reduce sensitivity to insulin.
Well, there's a paradox here, because fat tissue is highly sensitive to insulin. You need insulin to store fat in your fat cells. So when the body becomes insulin resistant, I expect that you should lose weight, that the fat cells should get rid of their fat. And that's not the case.
That's another hypothesis, which is the expandability hypothesis, which says that storage of lipids is normal. It's no problem. It's at the moment that lipids can no longer be stored safely in adipocytes, and they roam around freely in the body, and they get taken up by other tissues, such as muscle or liver, that is dangerous. So that might be part of the explanation for that paradox. But I agree that it's not a complete answer.
Someone else? Yes. Please wait for the sound.
I think there's a good human model for type 2 diabetes. For instance, an Indian tribe in the USA. One part of the tribe lives in a reservoir. The other part lives in, for instance, in San Francisco. And we know in the reservoir they are concerned with hunting every day for their food, and are not obese. And the other part of the same tribe living in the cities, they're getting obese. Should it be a better model than, for instance, the mouse model? Because you have to artificial make another model, and one of the differences, the head differences between the mouse vessels, for instance, and the human vessels, that's a huge difference between the architecture of a mouse. Normally spoken, in nature, mouse don't get arteriosclerosis, but people and pigs can get that. We should use people for that, and you don't have to create the people; they are existing.
That would be much, well, easier is maybe not the right word, but to perform all such experiments, I think it would be difficult to get the informed consent from these people. The mouse model, I agree, we have to generate models for atherosclerosis, and even then they do not show plaque rupture, for example. But at least they get plaques. But you can more easily test your far-fetched hypothesis on these models, which then, of course, need to be translated to the human condition. But I think this tribe is definitely interesting, and actually demonstrates that the effect of genetics is not as big. I think nowadays the estimates are for common genetic variants, only 5% explain obesity. So the other 95% must be something else, and now they're looking for medium rare variants, but I believe it's eating. Yeah, it's eating and moving. I think there's the answer. And I think the tribe specifically addresses that.
There we have to speed up. There is another question.
My name is Lindy Keulen and I'm studying arts and culture. And I'm wondering, wouldn't it be just way easier to just try to attack obesity itself instead of doing all this research?
That would be great.
But then why spending all the money on the research instead of spending it on trying to prevent it?
Because it's not that easy to do. And perhaps one of the reasons why is the fact that people have an enormous preference for fatty food. Because and that's what I showed in the first slide, evolution is always very gradual. And back in the days when there was much less food and we really had to fight to get food, it was a really good thing to be able to store fat so you could live through the winter. This is what several animals still do. So the preference for fatty foods and the ability to store excessive amount of fats in the fat tissue is actually evolutionary, a very good thing. But it's only the last 50 years that our eating habits and our moving habits have changed. And of course, evolution cannot catch up with such a rapid evolution. And that is why it's difficult to attack obesity because, of course, everybody knows obesity is bad, so still people are obese. So it's not that easy to do. There is one study, which is very interesting, which was comparing French schools, and half of the schools got in their educational programs really, they educated them about healthy food and they included some extra hours of physical exercise. And there they saw, indeed, that this affected later on obesity development. But I think changing one's lifestyle is very difficult. I think, for example, prices of gas will be very high until people stop driving their car. And we all know that it's expensive and bad.
Okay. Kristiaan Wouters, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.